Hi, I'm Phil Cooke. Over the years, I've had the opportunity to travel all over the world with Ron Harris, who has an organization called Media Alliance. Ron had a long-term media career in the Dallas area, and then he started focusing his work on helping teach and train people internationally to use media, particularly radio and television. And I've been to Russia with Ron, I've been to India with Ron, I've been to other places, and he asked me a year ago if I would speak at a conference he was putting together for this group of international media professionals. And so I couldn't be there, so I had to send him a video. And I thought recently that maybe that video would be good to share with you, because the thing I discussed was the secrets of long-term success. So many people start out doing amazing work, particularly in the media. They may be designers, they may be television producers, actors, writers, directors, whatever. They start out with the best of intentions, and they start out actually doing really great work. But before long, they start to drift. And sooner or later, they're selling real estate, they're selling insurance, they're doing something they never thought about doing or never felt called to do or aren't particularly passionate about it. So what happened? And I started on a real journey to figure out what makes people get off track. And so the interesting thing was, I started interviewing studio professionals, studio executives, film producers, television network executives. I wanted to find out people, particularly that I knew here in Hollywood, that have had long-term careers and done really, really well, because short of criminal activities, short of a, sexual impropriety, doing something wrong morale-wise, what are the things that really help you have that long-term career? Because very often I've discovered people get derailed and they have nothing to do with morality or their behavior or doing anything illegal. They just get derailed. And so I started interviewing these high-level executives and producers and creative leaders who had had a really long-term, really productive career. And what's funny was, I thought I would find things like integrity and character, focus, discipline, those kind of things. And of course, they're important. They're really critical. However, as I interviewed these people, men and women both, I started noticing certain things that they all did. Little things that you probably would never notice in a conversation unless, after two or three of these, it just really hit me that, wait a second, they all are saying the same thing in these particular areas. And they're really tiny, they're really small, what most people might seem or think as insignificant areas. But once they started to add up, I realized, what? We need to talk about this, because these are interesting things that every single person I interviewed did, and I think it made a great deal and contributed toward their long-term success. So listen to this talk. I pulled it back from I did it a number of months ago, but I think it's worth listening to because it's really the result of this serious deep dive I took into what helps leaders, particularly in creativity, in media and communication, what helps those leaders have really long-term careers. It's interesting that I really want to talk about finishing well. And of course, most people talk about that from a spiritual perspective. 2 Timothy 4 says, I've fought the good fight, I've finished the race, I've kept the faith, which is so important. And I don't know what country you're from, what town you're from, what city you're from, but I can tell you in the United States in the last few years, we've seen a remarkable number of leaders fall. Sometimes it's in ministry, sometimes it's in the entertainment world or in the media world, communications, executives, all kinds of people. We've just seen people that have not finished well. And so I've kind of got obsessed by this whole connection, this whole quest about how we do it. I don't want to get to the end of my life and discover that I just went in a wrong direction or work for decades and suddenly make some kind of a life-altering error or mistake. And at the same time, I've noticed something here in Hollywood. I live in Los Angeles and work here in the film and television industry. And one of the things I've noticed here is a number of executives or producers, filmmakers, creative people who are far more successful than me. They've done much bigger projects than I've ever done in my career, but suddenly I've noticed they're either struggling or they're not working at all. And I've been kind of fascinated by that because in many cases, these were people that didn't make big mistakes. They weren't taking advantage of their employees. They weren't embezzling money. They weren't cheating. They weren't doing anything illegal. They were doing the right things and still struggled and didn't finish well. So I started kind of an obsessive quest to go out and start interviewing people who have had long, successful careers in the industry. And I interviewed studio heads, I interviewed producers, guys that are making $100 million movies. I interviewed pastors and ministry leaders, executives, just a wide range of people who have gone through their life and been very successful in some capacity, particularly in media and communications, and are still doing great. And I wanted to find out what they're doing that we're not doing, or that some people aren't doing. And it's interesting, we normally think in terms of big picture issues like their relationship to God, their integrity, their character, and all those things are incredibly important. But as I started interviewing these leaders, I started seeing things that they did that were really small. I mean, really tiny, little, you might even call it insignificant things that I suddenly noticed all these people were doing. Men and women both, they were all doing these things. And so I wrote down, I made a list here of really 8 things, 8 key things that I noticed these long-term successful leaders were doing that a lot of people don't do. So I want to talk about those things. I want to cover those 8 things because as media professionals, as ministry leaders yourself, we have to be thinking in terms of how we finish well. So this is the list I want to go over. So just get a pencil and paper out. We're going to make some incredible notes and come up with a good list. Number 1 on the list is start writing things down. You know, it sounds so trivial, but I noticed in every interview I did, every time I met with one of these leaders, they were constantly writing things down. Now, here's the thing. It wasn't just meeting notes. They weren't writing, documenting the meeting we were having. But I noticed that every time an idea popped into their head, or every time we said something interesting, they jotted it down. Now, you're probably like me. I'm sure how many times have you woken up in the middle of the night and had a brilliant idea, just a life-changing idea, and thought, no problem, in the morning, you know what? I'll remember that. I'll get up and remember that. And of course, we never do. I've gotten in a habit of writing things down because I've recognized that our memory is so incredibly fragile. It's incredibly faulty. And if I don't write things down, I will completely forget about it. Let me tell you a story. I met a South African businessman here in Los Angeles a number of years ago at a Christmas party, and he was very wealthy. And so I started talking to him and I asked him, how did you make your money? Where did this come from? And he said, well, it's interesting you ask. He said years earlier, his wife had asked him to go shopping one time, and he hates shopping. And so he said, but I love my wife, so I went shopping with her. And he said, I decided to go sit on a bench out in the shopping mall while she went into a ladies' store to shop for a dress. And he said, I'm sitting there, he said, this was years ago, back in the early days of cell phones. In fact, he said, flip phones had just come on the market. And he said he started watching teenagers use their cell phones. And this thought occurred to him out of nowhere that what if those teenagers could download their favorite song and use it as a ringtone on their phone? And he thought, well, you know what? That's a great idea. And so he looked around, he found a pen, found a piece of paper, jotted down the note, put it in his pocket, and as he was literally putting it into his jacket pocket, his wife called him from the store. So he ran into the store to see what she wanted and immediately forgot about the idea. Forgot about the idea completely. Months went by. He said like 3 or 4 months went by. Went to the closet, pulled out that jacket again, put his hand in the pocket, and found that note. And immediately he was reminded of that night at the shopping mall. And he thought, you know what? This is a good idea. So he was very intentional about it. He bought the rights to 5 songs. He made a deal with a local cell phone company. And he said 2 years later, he set up an app, a system where kids could download one of these 5 songs onto their cell phone and use that as a ringtone. And he said, about 2 years later, he sold that company for almost $100 million. Now think about that. And that's when he looked at me and he said, but Phil, here's the thing. Had I not written that idea down, I would have completely forgotten about it. So my challenge to you is, what are the things that God could drop on you at a conference like this, or at driving down the road, or at a meeting somewhere, or sitting in church, or laying in bed at night? What are the ideas that God could drop on your life that could be absolutely life-changing, but if you don't write it down, you'll completely forget about them? Let me tell you, get in a habit. Right now I have a wallet, a little leather wallet that has note paper in it. I always carry around a little tiny pen with me. I've got 2 note-taking apps on my phone. I'm always want to be in a position where if an idea hits, I want to be able to jot it down. In fact, I created a a planner, the Unique Creative Planner. You can go to uniquecreativeplanner.com and find out about it, just because I believe so much in print. And by the way, research indicates that when we physically write things down, we remember it far longer and it goes much deeper into our spirit. So get in a habit of making notes, of writing things down, because you never know where the next life-changing idea is going to come from, and you need to be ready. I noticed in every single case, long-term leaders were in a habit of writing things down. The second thing I noticed about long-term leaders they were people that would default to action. They would default to action. In other words, they would rather make a mistake than make no decision at all. These were people that they were very intentional about the way they led and the way they lived their lives, and they would make decisions. Even, I think it's John Maxwell who says, if you have 70% of the information you need, make the decision. If you wait for all the information to come in, you'll be waiting forever. And so many leaders today waffle. I've consulted and coached many leaders who just can't bring themselves to make a decision. But I noticed long-term successful leaders always default to action. Now, I'm a big believer in I'd rather make a mistake than not make a decision, which means I want to make that mistake early so I have time to fix it. That's why you need to be able to make decisions quickly. And I actually think, making those kind of decisions makes you a much stronger leader. I have a friend who's a producer here in Los Angeles, a movie producer, been very successful in television. Now he's producing movies, and because of his success, he's had an enormous number of people send him scripts. They want him to look at their movie scripts and evaluate them and maybe buy them. And he finally got into a habit. He said, Phil, I started years ago. I decided to send the script back to the person and say, look, you send me 10 scripts. When you've written 10 scripts, he wanted them to default to action. They're writers. He wanted them to write. So he said, when you've written 10 scripts, you send me all 10 of them, tell me which one you want me to evaluate, and I promise you I'll do it. Now, he started doing that 10 years ago, a decade ago, and he's not had one single person take him up on it. We talk about being a writer, we talk about being a filmmaker, we talk about being a camera operator or video editor, but we don't actually do it. We don't actually do it. So get in a habit of defaulting to action. Start the business in your garage. Stop complaining that you don't have the money, that you haven't met a producer, that you haven't met a studio executive, that you don't have a publisher. You don't have money to start your project. Start it in your garage. There's 2 film festivals in the United States just for movies made on iPhones. They're making feature films on iPhones. So you have no excuse not to create the kind of media that God's called you to create. Default to action. Make decisions and move forward. Okay, number 3. One thing I've learned about long-term successful creative leaders is they're willing to take the hits. They're willing to take the hits. No matter what mistakes they've made, they're willing to own it and move forward. They don't deny it. They don't blame other people. They take the responsibility and move forward. This is so incredibly important. I met a guy here recently at a coffee shop. Came up to me, tapped me on the shoulder and said, hey, you're Phil Cooke, right? And I said, yeah. He said, man, I've read your books. I've heard you speak. I just wanted to introduce myself. And I said, well, what do you do? He said, he's a film director. And of course, everybody in LA is a film director, so I was very skeptical. But he told me 3 or 4 movies he'd directed, and sure enough, I knew them all. So I said, boy, that's fantastic. You're doing some great pictures. What's your next project? And he said, well, honestly, I'm managing an apartment complex. And I thought, whoa. How do you go from producing major movies to managing an apartment complex? And he told me that on his last film, a number of things had gone wrong. He said the studio took advantage of him. He didn't have all the money he needed to finish the film. His writer didn't turn in a great script. The actors didn't perform very well. And as he was saying this list, I realized he's never going to work in this industry again. Because honestly, not one time on that list did he say, Phil, honestly, I didn't make a good film. I didn't make sure the script was as good as it needed to be. I didn't deliver the movie on time. I went over budget. He didn't take responsibility for anything. He blamed everybody else about what went wrong with that movie. Let me tell you something. The sooner you take ownership of your mistakes and your bad ideas is the sooner you're going to start getting good ideas. It's incredibly, incredibly important to realize this and think about this. And here's why it's important. Even when it's not your fault, and I imagine right now in this group of people, there are people who are listening or watching right now, There are people that have been taken advantage of. I have. I've had ideas stolen. I've had people not pay me. I've had people take advantage of me in a wide variety of ways. But the truth is, the longer I blame them, the longer I criticize them, the longer I stay a victim, I'm never going to move my career forward. So, whether you've made mistakes or not, whether people have taken advantage of you or not, you have to own it. Own it, make it yours, and move forward. Otherwise, you'll never get to where you want to go. And one of the things that frustrates me is people blame God for their failures. I spoke at a conference a few years ago, and I remember I was invited to speak by a guy who put on the conference, and not very many people came. I mean, not very many people at all came to the event. And he said, you've heard this before, he said, I guess these are just the people God wanted to be at the conference. And I said, no. Maybe you're just a really terrible marketer. Maybe you're bad at promoting this thing. Maybe you're not any good at putting on conferences, or maybe you hired the wrong speakers. Stop blaming God for the mistakes that happen in your life. Own them. Own them. Take responsibility, because until you do, you're never going to move forward. I'm just going to tell you, long-term successful leaders have the confidence to absorb the hits. I've even had situations where leaders had people on their team make mistakes, employees make mistakes, volunteers make mistakes, and the leader took the responsibility for it. He didn't blame that person. He didn't blame that guy or that girl. He took the responsibility, and because of that, was able to move forward. So be willing to take the hits if you're going to be successful long term. The fourth thing I would say is, I discovered about long-term leaders is they are absolutely ruthless about their time. Ruthless about their time. In other words, they are very careful not to squander the time they have. Whether you spend 8 hours a day in the office, 10 hours a day, 15 hours a day, or 4 hours a day, doesn't matter, but you need to maximize the time that you do spend. Dreaming is great, but execution is what moves careers forward. We need to move forward. I'll give you a good example of how we waste time. Too many of us leave our door open during the day, and anybody in the office that wants to can just come in, plop down on the sofa, and just talk. You know what? That wastes so much time. I think in America we call it the open door policy. I just think that whoever invented the open door policy is an idiot. I'm sure he meant well, but the truth is, it's a terrible, terrible business strategy. One study indicated that when you're working in your office and somebody walks in and interrupts you, once they've left, it takes 25 to 40 minutes to get back to that same level of focus you were at before that person walked in the door. So the question is, how many of those interruptions can you handle in a day before your entire day is blown and you've got nothing accomplished? Let me tell you something. Learn to be ruthless about your time. I had an assistant years ago that walked into my office one day and said, Phil, I've been tracking your time for the last 2 months. And I've noticed that you spend more time helping other people with their career than you spend helping us develop this company. And she said, that's okay, you can do that if you want, but if you do, the company will be out of business in a couple months. And she was absolutely right. And so we sat down and we started putting a wall around me and my time. Not everybody could get access. And here's the thing, you don't have to be a jerk about it. You could be very gracious, but understand, here's the thing. If God's called you to accomplish something significant in your life, you need to say no to some things. You need to turn down some requests. You need to not take every meeting, every phone call that comes in. You need to spend time focusing on what God has called you to do. In fact, Warren Buffett, the great investor, said one of my favorite quotes of all time. He said that the difference between successful people and really successful people is really successful people say no most of the time. Wow, what a great quote. They understand the value of their time. They understand the focus they need to have in their work. They understand what their calling is. And you know what? They focus on that. So all I'm saying is be gracious. Don't be a jerk. Don't start cutting people out of your life. But understand, if you want to be successful, you have to say no to some things that are keeping you away from what God's called you to do in your life. It's interesting. We, at our company, people used to call me up all the time and want my advice about their career. And they would want to come over and just sit and talk for a couple hours, never thinking about paying me for the time or never thinking about, reciprocating in any way. And I was frustrated. And I'm happy to help people. I love it, but I just can't do that over and over and over again, or as I said, my company will suffer, and my own career will suffer, and my calling will suffer. So one day, my daughter Kelsey was working with us at the time, and she said, Dad, when people call like that, let me take care of it. So people would call and say, hey, can I come over and meet with Phil and talk to him about my career? And she said, absolutely, of course. In fact, we've had so many requests. Phil's blocked off 2 days a week just for people to come in and talk about his career. And you know what? It starts at $350 an hour. And she said, the funny thing was, the phone got really quiet. And she said 80% of those calls, the people never called back again. But 20% said, that's amazing. That's great. Where do I sign up? So I actually started making money off saying no. So here's the thing. Again, and I want to drive this home, don't be a jerk. Don't be rude. Don't be condescending, but start protecting your time. People that are successful for the long term, they build a wall around them to a great degree, and they're ruthless about how to maximize their productivity, how to maximize their creative time, so incredible projects can happen. Okay? You with me? Number five, stop making decisions. And I know this is a strange one. But here's what I discovered. Research came out just recently that the average person makes about 35,000 decisions every single day. Now think about it. We are decision-making machines. What time do we get up? What do we eat for breakfast? What do we put on? How do we get to work? What do we do? All day long, we're making decisions. In fact, there's an actual term, psychological clinical term, called decision fatigue. And we're finding out in classic cases of burnout, you've heard for years, leaders suffer from burnout, pastors, ministry leaders, executives suffer from burnout. And we always thought it was putting in too many hours, it was working too hard, it was just the stress of their job. Now, we're finding out in many, many cases, it's simply decision fatigue. In fact, studies have shown a group of Israeli judges who do probation. They decide if a prisoner goes to jail or gets probation. One study of Israeli judges came out and it indicated that in the morning, in the first part of the day, they give probation to 8 out of 10 prisoners that come in front of them. But as the day goes on, in the late afternoon, they start giving probation out to only 2 or 3 out of every 10 that come in front of them. In other words, just making so many decisions all day long gets them tired, and they start being really conservative about the decisions they make. So what is my point? The point is, think about decision fatigue. How many decisions do you make a day that you could delegate to someone? First of all, delegate to someone. Do you have an assistant on your team? Do you have a staff? Do you have people that you could farm those decisions out to? Let other people make those. If you're micromanaging your organization, you're going to be a massive failure. Learn to delegate. The second thing is, what are the decisions you're making that don't need to be made at all? I think it was management consultant Peter Drucker who said the worst thing you could possibly do is make a great decision about something that doesn't matter. Truthfully, I think sometimes we make decisions just to show everybody we're the boss. We make decisions just to show that we're a part of this project. We make decisions just to show our status in the company. We make decisions about things on a typical day that we just have no business making. So think about that. Stop making as many decisions as you do. It's hard. Trust me, it's hard. I mean, remember in the old days, if I would go buy a pair of shoes at the store, I'd go into a shoe store and there were maybe 7 or 8 types of shoes in my size. Well, now I go online to Amazon.com or some other site, and there are thousands of shoes in my size to pick from. So we've gotten into this habit of just making decision after decision after decision. Here's the thing, streamline the decisions you make in your life. It'll help you with your energy, it'll help you with your confidence, and it will help you make better decisions when you do have to make critical decisions. That was number 5, stop making decisions, okay? Number 6, discover your one big thing. Now, I wrote a book a number of years ago called One Big Thing, Discovering What You Were Born to Do. And the whole premise of the book is we can't be experts at everything. In fact, the last thing you want to be is, in fact, let me put it this way. In most groups like this that I'm talking to, I would say most people are pretty good at a lot of things. Those people never get noticed. The people that get noticed, the people that break through, are people who are extraordinary at one big thing. The question becomes, what is that one area of expertise? What I've noticed here in Hollywood in the entertainment industry, many times when we're young, I was certainly this way in my 20s. I edited, I ran camera, I set lights, I did a little bit of everything. I directed, I produced, I cleaned up the set at the end of the day. I did a little bit of everything, but as I progressed in the industry and as I moved up the ladder, I started letting go of things. I started letting go of editing. I don't run camera anymore. I focus mostly on writing and producing. I learned that if I'm going to be really good and extraordinary at those, I need to let go of a lot of other things. So in your own life, sometimes we have a low budget and we have to do a little bit of everything. I get that. But the thing is, start focusing on what you're amazing at doing. What is that thing that you're incredible at doing? The more and the sooner you focus on that, I'll tell you what, the better you're going to be. If you want to influence the world with your message, with your gift, with your calling, you've got to figure out what that one big thing is in your life. And you can certainly order my book, One Big Thing, Discovering What You Were Born to Do, and that walks you through a process of helping you do it. But I'll tell you, figuring it out is going to be incredibly important in your own life. Number 7, the 7th thing I would say is understand the power of your story. Let me explain. I just believe for every one of us hearing this, your story matters. Your past matters. The journey God has brought you through matters. The obstacles you've overcome matter. The victories matter. The failures matter. All those things make you who you are. Certainly with filmmaking here in LA, you can come out here and be a television producer. Well, guess what? There are thousands of television producers competing for the job. But when you figure in your past, your background, your history, your story, there's only one producer like you. Only one. So whatever you do, you may be a pastor, a ministry leader, communications director at a church or ministry. You may be a filmmaker. You may be a writer. Whatever it is you do, think of how your story could influence and impact the way you work. Now that baffles me, honestly, that people, thousands of people, I've met thousands of people over my career that go to work every day, never once thinking about how I integrate who I am into what I do. And yet, let me tell you something, the legends out there, the people that have long-term success, the people that accomplish great things with their career, are people who have figured out really how to integrate who they are into what they do. Now, here's the thing. In a group like this, a typical group, a lot of people will say, but Phil, I don't have an interesting story. I've never accomplished anything great. Nobody cares about my story. Let me tell you 2 things. Number 1, in 40 years of doing this, in 4 decades of doing this, I can tell you there's somebody out there that needs to hear your story. Someone out there that is struggling with something you've overcome, trying to figure out what you've already accomplished, and they would be incredibly encouraged to hear your story. Get it out there. The second thing is stories fascinate people. And I don't just mean any kind of story. Let's talk about this. Origin stories. If you look at collectible comic books, graphic novels and collectible comic books about superheroes, for instance, the collectible comic books, the most expensive ones on the market are origin stories. How Iron Man got started, how Superman got started, how Batman got started. People are fascinated with origin stories. So your story about how you began, how you started your career, how you came to Christ, how you launched your career, how you started your business, whatever it is you do, that origin story is going to connect with people. In fact, I've worked with leaders that told their origin story over and over and over and over again so much, I just got sick of hearing it. One leader actually pulled him aside and I said, look, give that story a rest. People are sick of hearing it. But it was years later that I realized that I'm an idiot, that it was that origin story that connected him to people, because in his case, it was a story about God healing him as a young man. And that means that telling that story encourages other people to believe that if God did it for him, he could do the same thing for them. So let me tell you something. Your story matters far more than you thought. And the minute you start thinking it doesn't, remember that God thinks so much of your story that he was willing to sacrifice his only son in a brutal death on a cross to win that story back. And yet you think so little of your story that you never integrate that into how you work, what you do, how you present yourself. I'll tell you, if I was you, the first thing I would do when I go back to my hotel or go back to my apartment or go back to my room or my house is sit down and think about how your story could be integrated into what you do and how you do it. Because let me tell you something, that separates you from everybody else. It puts you on the map and makes you completely unique. Your story matters. And finally, number 8, I would say the last thing I would encourage you with is understand the power of teams. Understand the power of teams. It's so funny that leaders that I work with time and time again really don't understand how to utilize their team. And the truth is, you may be with a small organization or a small church or a small group that you can't afford to have a staff, or a paid team. But I would develop volunteers, unpaid interns, volunteers. Teach and train them. You have to be willing to invest in them. So many leaders aren't willing to delegate because they don't want to take the time to invest in younger people. But number 1, you're teaching the younger generation, which is important. Number 2, you're delegating your work so you can accomplish more and focus on what you're really called to do. I just think learning how to lead teams is one of the most important things you will ever do. The truth is, the higher you go up the ladder, the bigger teams you'll have. Learn to speak in front of those teams. Learn to encourage and inspire those teams. If you want to really accomplish something in your life, that is incredibly, incredibly important. And the funny thing about teams are the lowest person on the team has a vital role to play. I worked on projects here in Hollywood and in other places around the world where I was a nobody. I was really the least experienced or the least expert on the team, and yet I had a role to play that matters. And I'm that way with my crew and my team today. I want to make sure everybody on there understands the role that they have to play. So let's talk about our 8 things real quick. Let's go over them. Number 1, start writing things down. Get in the habit. Go out today, get a little pad, paper, iPhone app, whatever it takes, whatever's helpful for you, and start writing things down. Number 2, people with long-term success default to action. Start making decisions. Stop putting things off. Stop procrastinating. Move forward. Number 3, long-term leaders are willing to take the hits, take the responsibility, step up to the plate. Stop blaming people. Stop being a victim. Absorb the hits and move on. Number 4, be ruthless about your time. Let me tell you something. We have a limited amount of time on the earth, and God's called us to do amazing things. Let's take advantage of that. That's really very important. Number 5, stop making decisions. We make way too many decisions a day, and by the end of that day, we are dead. Man, we are tired. We just can't do it anymore. Stop making all those decisions. Number 6, discover your one big thing. What is the one thing you're really called to do? What is the one thing that you're better than anybody else at doing? What's that niche that you could fill that would make you completely unique? Number 7, understand the power of your story. From this day on, I want you to start integrating what you do and who you are into how you do it. And number 8, understand the power of teams. Thanks so much for letting me do this. I think this teaching is incredibly important because we always need to be thinking about how we can last the long term and be a leader that will inspire people for the rest of our lives. I hope you appreciated that. It really said something to me, and I thought it was so significant. I've been sitting on it for a while. I actually shot that a few months ago, but I thought this would be a really great time to release it. And I think that if we just think about these things, I hope you wrote them down, and if you didn't, check the notes. If you didn't, go back and listen to it again. I just think this is really critically important for us as we think about how to have a long-term career in the media, communications, movie, television industry. It's absolutely critical. So thanks for watching. That's a big deal, and I don't say that enough. And I appreciate you talking about my new book. If you haven't ordered it yet, I'd encourage you to get it, Maximize Your Influence, How to Make Digital Media Work for Your Church, Your Ministry, and You. I think if you have a leader, if you know a leader that really isn't sure about how to use media most effectively, buy this book for him or her. It may be a pastor, it may be a CEO, it may be a president, maybe an executive director of a nonprofit. I really focused it on pastors and church leaders, but the truth is, any leader will benefit from this. And it's designed to be really a reference book, so they can jump into it anywhere. And I talk about all kind of things from social media to broadcast television to short videos, even talking, how to do presentations to this digital generation that we live in, and so much more. How to lead creative teams is a big part of the book. So I'd encourage you, you ought to get it, go through it, share it with a leader that you know, and continue to comment on these posts. Keep sharing them, keep giving us ratings, give us your comments. All those things just work together to help more people get to see this material. And again, go to my blog at philcooke.com, Philcooke, because that's really the hub of everything we do here at Cooke Media Group. And one thing I'd encourage you to check into is our nonprofit organization, the Influence Lab, influencelab.com. That's really what this talk came out of today, helping men and women, professionals, use media more effectively all over the world. And that's the vision of that nonprofit. And I'd love to have you donate, help us give, help us support that, because the work is never ending. At any given moment, I probably have 10 or 12 invitations on my desk, people asking us to come and teach and train at churches, at nonprofit organizations, ministry organizations, some business executives, but in almost every case, they can't afford to pay the full expense of us coming. And so your help is so needed financially to help keep this training, keep this teaching going, because it's really making a difference internationally. Thanks for tuning in, and look for us next time.